My name is Paul Nunes-Dier. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and his team PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily. Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. It's so good to be here again with all of you watching us right now, and again with my co-host as usual, Martin Duffy, and again with our guest speaker, Ruud Jason. Good morning, Martin.
Good morning, Paul. Good morning, Ruud. You're very welcome back after our fascinating conversation the last day. I'm really looking forward to having a follow-on and probably a deeper dive with some of the themes or topics that you brought up with us.
Oh, thank you, Paul and Martin. It's a treat to be here for round two.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And we normally start our episodes with a question that we asked already, Ruud, last time. But maybe, Martin, you can start to ask this question again, and we discover something else from Ruud's fantastic life.
Yeah, well, there was a musical inspiration to our previous question, Ruud, or rather a musical inspiration to your response. We learned some fascinating background on your musical history, playing trumpet, and more particularly on your record-breaking contribution in Switzerland with the Alphorn of all things. Are there any other little tidbits that you might have in your past that people would not generally be aware of?
Oh, that's a challenging question, Martin. I think there's one question that I'd like to ask in return, right? Because the curiosity you have about my background is a curiosity I have about our second take.
Sure.
In a book that we wrote called Design to Change, we open the conversation with a question, and the question is: a good conversation can shift the direction of change forever. Would you leave it to chance?
Cool.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that, Ruud, because that brings us into the core of what we are up to here, trying also to create the foundations for the architecture of collaboration. As I recently published in an article, these conversations and these interviews I'm having here with Martin is a meeting expert that I admire so much. And this is also a source of inspiration for what we are all about here. And Martin,
and you didn't leave it to chance, right, Paul?
Absolutely.
We took a hardcore decision to say, okay, now let's have the next one then at that time and regather, and so chance encounters, I don't know if they exist, but sometimes they're planned.
Absolutely. I'm curious to learn more about how you develop your own canvas. But as Martin proposed, let's watch, and for our viewers, watch the summary of the last episode so that the viewers can gain a little bit of more background of where we are right now. If you may, I'm going to start sharing here the last the summary that Martin made on the episode, for your enjoyment and also for your gaining a background of the past conversation. I hope you enjoy this video.
Paul, you introduced Ruud as a designer of time, which is a fascinating way to think about our meetings and our events. Ruud, you immediately distinguish between event management versus event designing. And let's focus then on event designing. You introduced us to the idea of needing more time to do what? And we can make choices, we can create value. You summarized with crafting, quantifying and celebrating the value of time. With that in mind, you then introduce us to the event canvas, which is kind of your core philosophy, if you want, if I've interpreted that correctly. And you mentioned two key elements to that, the idea of multiple stakeholders and bringing about behavior change. Now, you did mention that there's a 14-step element mixed into all of that. So obviously, I'm really parsing out something quite big into something very small here. You then introduced us to the story behind the book that yourself and your colleagues wrote about 9 years ago with the 8-year-old, which introduced us to the idea of generational perspectives and how the different perspectives of the participants in events need to be taken into account. And you again brought us into the idea of stakeholder analysis, empathy stakeholder analysis, or empathetic stakeholder analysis. You mentioned, but we didn't get to explore the idea of the collective brain, which is a theme or a topic that I'd really love to come back to. And I have a personal interest in that from my own background. We might come back to that another day, Ruud, if we could be so bold. The challenge of getting time to think was a key question that you spoke about. And the power then of using facilitation. So where executives need time to think, they can benefit from having facilitation because now they can participate. The facilitator doesn't participate, they manage the process to get an outcome. Whereas by bringing a facilitator to an event, the executive has the possibility to engage rather than run the event.
Yeah.
You then posed a key fundamental question that actually has been a recurring theme with us in this podcast series for the last 3 years. And that is, why do people take part in the events? And if we don't bottom out that question, then we're going to lose at least half, if not all, of the participants to an event. You corrected me absolutely correctly in saying that we do actually have education in events in 35 universities through the event design certificate. I was really delighted to hear that, and I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe that's another podcast, Paul, that we could do at some point. There's a final point that you made, your very last comment. I've written it down, and I think it's a fantastic analogy. But events, and I'll call them meetings, because big or small, I think they're the same. They're the petri dishes of culture and culture change. There's an expression that I've used myself over a number of our podcasts, and that is that meetings are the window to the soul of the organization. But I think you've characterized it in a very different, but actually, I think more provocative way. I think calling it the petri dishes of culture and culture change, I think that's a fantastic way to summarize what meetings and events of any organization are and should be.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you so much, Ruud, for spending the time with us. Yes, so this was the summary from last episode. Let's kick off the conversation today.
Dive straight in. Yeah, that was a whirlwind, Ruud. We touched on a couple of really interesting themes or topics. Could I bring you actually to your core philosophy to kick us off again? The event canvas. We touched on just 2 elements of the event canvas, but you did say to us that there were 14 components. Now, we don't necessarily have to cover all of them, but could you give us a little bit more insight into the event canvas as you've developed it over time?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's important is when you talk between team members about something, is the ability to use a common language. And by common language, we don't mean, let's speak in Portuguese or in English or in French or in Spanish. But by common language, we mean that when we say words, that we don't assume meaning or assimilate meaning to those words the way that they may have been seeded in the past, but that there's a clear understanding of what the thing is that we're talking about in that specific cubicle. You spoke about 14 different cubicles. I drink my coffee on a daily morning with the canvas on one side, so I don't forget what the 14 cubicles are. But having tested and it took us, Wolfrisse and Dennis and myself, and in an incubator, it took us up to a year to come up with this single piece of paper, right? So sometimes you think, writing something on a piece of paper can be easy, but making it stand the test of time is pretty difficult. Yeah. To go back to to the music that you recently mentioned, Martin, music really only has 5 things going for it, right? They are 5 lines, 5 perpendicular lines, and somehow we manage, with the millions and millions of tunes out there, to capture it on that very simple structure that people can interpret. Now, that fascination led us to think, how could composers and non-composers and conductors and musicians, we orchestrate meetings and events together. How could we bring these people together on the same page? And so when we crafted the canvas, the core principle there was the behavior change, right? So what you'll see is there's 3 steps to the 14 cubicles. The first step is the change from the entry of the event to the exit of the event. And so the change part is really important to define because the change is different for different stakeholders. And so if you look at entry behavior, which the camera and the microphone can observe very clearly, right? Mm-hmm. You can record and document what's in the opening frame. How do people walk into this event? They come in with a series of expectations, and they have some gains that they have to get out of this event. So this is like how they come in. As they walk out, people are expecting some gains for being in that session, just like in this conversation we're having here. And they have a level of satisfaction, which is offset against the level of expectation before they started the event. So let's pretend that those 6 cubicles are the change, right? Step 1. Step 2 are all of the design restrictions, everything that limits what you're trying to do. The commitment in time, the expected return, the cost, right? The fixed and variable cost that's involved in attending an event, the revenues you're expecting from it, from that stakeholder perspective, the jobs that it gets done, right? Because at the end of the day, people go to meetings or go to events to get jobs done, to get stuff done. Functional jobs, social jobs, emotional jobs, and basic needs, right? The last thing that's in the frame part in that second step is called the event promise. Now, Paul has a Christmas tree behind him, right? Out of the 3 of us, that marks a moment in time. And very often under the Christmas tree, why are we so excited about it? Is because there's gifts underneath that you open and you go, oh, what's inside, right? And it could be the promise of having a family together. It could be what's actually in the box that's important to you. Or it could be the moment that you give the box that's more important to you. And all of these things are what events can do, right? So those 6 elements, right? The commitment, the return, the cost, the revenue, jobs to be done, the promise, those frame, limit the design and put restrictions on what you're trying to create. And restrictions are the most wonderful thing you can have as a designer because they make you creative as a team. Those are the 12 blocks you were talking about before. Now there's 2 blocks left. And for the 2 blocks that are left, I'm going to use the concept of time for a second, right? Because the concept in the middle is actually the hourglass of how you spend your time. There's a series of experiences. In this conversation, you experienced a recording of our past conversation to recap in 3 minutes what we talked about in 1 hour. And as a result, we learned what the 3 key points are that came out of it. And so on the bottom, if this is the experience, then this part is the instructional design. What are the skills, knowledge, attitude, and people learning that happen as a result of going through the experience? And as the time passes for your event, and as it falls through the funnel, you are learning, you're filling your cup of skills, knowledge, attitude, and people learning that you're going through. And that's the last part, which is really the prototype of how you do the meeting. because you could take a really big flask that would have more time. You could use a clock, which is just a different prototype to measure time, or anything else that would kind of represent that. So there's always multiple ways in which you can get things done. And so what's really important, I think, in the creation of the canvas is that it represents the ability for a group of people to park the problem outside of themselves on the wall. We tend to use big A0 size posters.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens in that sequence is that people actually look at that poster together and they go, okay, now let's put Post-its and 7 people together, facilitated by one person, add to this in a very systematic way to create a narrative together that when you do that together, you are able to then take those 3 elements, right, from the change, right, that we talked about, the frame, and then the prototype in the middle, which is that hourglass of time that passes by. And then together, those elements really form, you know, the concept of change, frame, prototype, which is actually the concept of event design. And so if people do that together in a group, they're able to design things very systematically. And they go through that process, you know, in a certain order and sequence, so that from articulating who is the stakeholder and what ideas do we have, being able to define and empathize with those stakeholders, to define the behavior change, the delta, to then create multiple prototypes, to then actually define which prototype do we think is going to work best, to then be able to plan that out and have the narrative ready, carried by the group of people. That's really the concept of putting thoughts of a group of people outside of themselves so they can look at it, reflect on it, and not be against each other when my idea seems better than your idea. But it builds on this concept that we talked about before of the power of third thought, where if the 3 of us each have an idea that we try to defend, but instead of that, we build on each other's idea, then new ideas pop out that are cumulative or better than whatever the original idea was, without having ownership issues of the idea. And that's why when we always start with this idea of the idea quarantine, right? This element over here, where even before you do any design session, the only thing we ask people to do is just drop all your ideas there.
Yeah.
And the quarantine allows the ideas to become anonymized because you forget who contributed which idea. There's no name connected to it, right? So whether the idea comes from the CEO or the junior trainee, you know, after a while you forget.
Yeah.
You know, and quarantine, as you know, comes from the 40 days that people were left on the ship in Venice to decontaminate before they were allowed into the village or into the city. So whether it's 40 seconds, 40 minutes, 40 hours, 40 days, 40 years, leave the ideas there to ferment until you're actually ready to take decisions on the idea based on the delta, on, you know, does it change the behavior in the desired direction of change? So it's just a simple piece of paper, but the process behind it orchestrates the brain power of a group of people to come out with the best possible reduction, really, right? Because good design is like Michelangelo's David, right? David is already inside the marble block. All you have to know is what to take away to leave David in the middle. Right? That's what good event design represents. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a wonderful summary of what is obviously a very complex, in some ways, but very simple idea. Like the ideas that you're putting forward there, they're simple to grasp, but as you said to us, it took a year with 3 of you to get it onto a page, and I can fully appreciate the difficulties and complexities of turning something complex into something simple. There's a key part of what you mentioned there, Ruud, which is the behavior change. From your experience, could you talk to us a little bit about handling that behavior change, either before, during, or after the event, or all 3? Just your perspective on that behavior change piece.
Oh, but behavior change seems so simple, right? It's probably the most complex things we're trying to do, right? So if you could articulating behavior seems so easy. But if it was so easy, we would all be scriptwriters in Hollywood movies or Netflix series that could actually picture and say, here's the opening frame, right? Now, yesterday I was looking at the movie, which I've seen before, Captain Sully. right? Captain Sully landed a plane in the Hudson in January 15th of January 2009. And at the very end of the hearing of the National Safety Transportation Board, one of the board members asks the first pilot, so not Captain Sully, but the first pilot, one very interesting question. He said, if you would do this again, is there anything you would do differently? Right? And this is behavior change, right? And I don't know if you've seen the movie recently, but
I did, and I remember the line.
It's an amazing movie.
Yeah.
Right? And he says, I would have done it in July.
Yeah.
Right? Because in January, it's so cold, and that people, within 2 minutes would get hypothermia when they fell into the water, or, so seeing the opportunity for alternative options, even in a moment of distress, which for many people, owning an event is a moment of distress, right?
Yeah.
They're the captain of a flight where the engines might have been hit by birds, right? Yeah. That's how event ownership feels to many people. And so our task is not just to simulate, to train, to come up with alternatives, and to figure out, should we land at Teterboro, or should we go back to LaGuardia, or should we, all of the options that were demonstrated also in that movie. And it reminded me of behavior change, right? Why? How do you articulate behavior? Because there's always an action verb. There's always, a specific stakeholder involved. There's something that they're saying in the speech bubble. And if you dumb it down to a comic book strip, almost like a storyline, what you're doing with an event is you're basically building the gutter between the frames, right? The guy that does the visuals for our book, Dennis Lawyer, absolutely brilliant thinker that never stopped drawing when he was 7, like most of us, when we learned the alphabet. He just kept drawing. And one of the things he says when he talks about the difference between the interpretation of behaviors and time between what we do in the West and what people do in the East. If you look at comic strips in Japan versus comic strips made in the Western world, do you know what the core difference is?
No.
You already know the answer. The core difference is that the gutter, which is the white line between the two frames, very often in Japanese comics is much longer than in Western comic strips, which is interesting because the mind wonders what happens in between, right? From entry behavior to exit behavior. The bigger the gap in between, the more responsibility for the event designer to figure out what needs to happen in the middle. And sometimes the magic is in not knowing and letting happen what happens between people, to give that space and just claim the space, the time, the team, and the space for that to happen. And I think that's why many people know that events and meetings are magic, because if you put people into a space together and you lock them up for a while, gently, right? And you give them an overarching aim, something that they might want to achieve together, then somehow, Captain Sully and the first pilot, within 35 seconds, came up with landing on the Hudson instead of landing at Teterboro or landing at LaGuardia, right? Now, luckily, we don't all pilot planes and have 155 passengers behind us. Although, granted, many events have many more passengers and a much bigger responsibility without flight attendants or any safety ramps. And I think we have to think about this.
Absolutely. But Martin, I'm sure you have a series of questions, if I may interrupt now.
Absolutely. No, go for it.
As you're leading the moderation at this point. Ruud, it's fascinating. And I was already preparing to show your website to our viewers, which I'll probably do in the end so that they can reference you on the resources that you offered. And by the way, dear viewers, the event canvas that Ruud just explained so graphically is free. It's public domain, right? So everybody can use it on every meetings that you are hosting. And my question is, and Martin, you might guess, is how do you connect this with everyday meetings, right? Because there's an effort to absorb this model. It's a pretty straightforward model, as we just saw it, but it requires a certain amount of time to absorb. And obviously, I also assume that you have training programs well lined up for anyone interested to acquire interiorized these models. But how do you relate this with everyday meetings and everyday conversations? Should we take this model each time we have to meet with someone?
Is that a question to me, Paul, or to
Yeah.
Martin?
No,
Yeah.
to you.
Well, what's interesting is yes and no. Maybe not all the elements, but the one thing that I found very useful, and this is a practice that we've developed over time. We've been doing this for about a decade and doing only that, right? And it's pretty amazing what you can achieve if you can have a single focus and be very laser focused on doing just that. The progress you can make and the tests you can do around this. Whenever we go into, my colleague Roel and I, or other colleagues, when we go into a conversation with an event owner, before we go into the conversation, we always ask ourselves the question, how do we go into this? What do we expect? What are our pains before? And how does the other person across the table go into this? And what are their pains and what are their expectations? And at what point after this next meeting, whatever, it might be a 50-minute meeting, would we find this a good investment of our time, right? Would this be a good return to have spent those 50 minutes of the other person and of ourselves? And we actually say to each other, here's our exit behavior, these are our gains, and these are the level of satisfaction versus our expectation. We just say it out loud to each other. Because very often you walk away from a meeting like that and you think, if it's very positive, our bias implies that you might have gotten much more out of it than you actually did, right? But if you set the expectation before and you actually articulate how you go away from that thing, without even writing it down with Post-its and taking out the whole kit and inviting 7 people, and for smaller units of change, that can be done. I'm sure many of your viewers, Paul and Martin, are planning their celebrations for the holiday season, whichever part of the world they're in. But everybody has this kind of, oh, here's how we go in. These are our pains, right? You have to set up the Christmas tree, take out the lights, vacuum all of the needles that fell on the floor. You've got to put in all of the decorations. We all know the pains of creating a Christmas tree, right? And we also know our expectation is that by the of January, we have taken the tree back down again and cleaned everything up and hope to find the right box for the right decoration thing so that next year it's not broken, right? These are things that we all go through and we can predict how they go. And so the challenge, I think, here is the mental model, as it's called. If you really become very proficient, you can do this in your head for yourself. But here's the bad news. Event design is not a solo sport. It cannot be done alone, right? You might be able to fly a plane solo, but there's never just one captain on a plane. There's always a co-pilot. And actually in this cockpit for event design, we recommend there to be 7 people who think and 1 person to orchestrate the thinking. Because the ability to come closer to the truth, if the stakes are higher, or the group of people you're serving is bigger, then you need to, as we call it, invest 1% of the total event time. Total event time being, let's pretend those people were flying from LaGuardia to Charlotte, right? And it's a 2-hour flight. And there's 155 people times 2, right? That would mean 310 hours. Am I saying that correctly? No, 410 hours, right? Of total event time. Now, the flight only takes 2 hours. But do you think they spend 1% of the total event time to think about how this flight might go? Planning out the weather, coming up with alternative flight plans, predicting and having checklists in place to do things in a specific process and order? They do, and they actually simulate it to check whether that's the best way to do it. And then still things happen that you might not expect, right? And so, again, quite a long answer, but to demonstrate that we all have the innate ability through our prefrontal cortex to think, if I do this, then that's likely to happen. But if we, the 3 of us, would combine our prefrontal cortexes with our different backgrounds and our predictive powers become exponentially more powerful, almost like, artificial intelligence, but then as human intelligence, then the likelihood of getting it right is much bigger. And so this is the reason why we say it's not a solo sport.
Yeah, actually, as you're saying that, Ruud, I was a professional pilot myself for 20 years, hence the photographs on the wall behind me. But I watched the Hudson film. I've read into the background of Sully. But there was one, apart from that wonderful line that you quoted at the very end of the film, there was another line that Sully himself came out with. And when a lot of praise was being heaped on him for being the architect of the outcome, he actually said,
Saving
no,
155 people. Yeah.
he said, it wasn't me, it was us. And
Yes.
that fundamental key point for me is the single biggest takeaway from that film, that if all of the people involved, from the maintenance people at the very beginning before the flight ever took off, to the tugboat drivers, to the medics who had the blankets after people were rescued, everybody had a part to play. And I think that concept, bringing that concept of collective into the meeting space or the meeting environment, becomes enormously powerful, which I think is a slightly different way of saying exactly the point, or at least that's my understanding of the point that you just given us there. I love the way that you framed it. Use many people to think and use one person to orchestrate the thinking. Would I be right in inferring, Ruud, certainly in my experience anyway, very often it can be almost the opposite. Very often in places, in organizations with groups, one person seems to do the thinking, and a whole lot of people try to do the orchestrating, instead of use the many, the collective capacity of the many. But that brings me to another question, actually, which you raised the last day, we only skirted on, but it's this idea of collective brain power. So you've again segued us into it. Could you expand that a little bit for us from your experience? What you mean by collective brain power and the power of collective?
Absolutely. I think what's so interesting is that the biggest talent or the biggest need that you would need from somebody that orchestrates the event or comes up with the idea is the ability to suspend their disbelief, right? And that sounds so easy, but suspending disbelief is the hardest thing that you need to do, probably as a facilitator or as somebody that is on the receiving end of a challenge, of a problem. Because there's that sweet spot between the known and the unknown, right? Where originality happens. And the key for good event design is to linger there as long as possible without panicking, right? And to suspend the team's willingness and drive to come to a solution, right? Now, this can be particularly tricky when you're dealing with problem solution type people, right? Who very often, leaders are very often action driven. Chung, let's get on with it. Come on, tuck, right? Like, no, I hired you to do this, go and do it for me or whatever, Or, we recently did an event design session for 212 IEEE engineers in Hawaii, facilitating during a plenary session. We designed together for 13 different stakeholders. We designed a climate change conference that's going to happen next year in Glasgow. And orchestrating the brain power of 212 PhDs. Now, I'm surrounded by 2 PhDs. That in itself is very often a daunting experience, right, for most facilitators, because the brain power in the room was obscenely powerful, right? And so your responsibility as a facilitator to harness that power and to guide it and to provide let's say, guardrails to jump into the tiger's mouth of coming up with options, right? That is a challenging proposition in itself, right? But the fact that you are able to make people think, right? Somebody told me some time back when we did actually after that session, it was one of the people came up to me and they said, "Thank you, you've given me the greatest gift." Or I think they sent it on LinkedIn afterwards, and I was a bit surprised. I said, "Thank you for what?" I said, "Thank you for making me think. It's the biggest gift you can give someone." I was like, I had to think about that for a minute, right? Because I thought that the purpose of thinking was to stop thinking, right? Because it takes a lot of energy to think, right? And so the one thing that they try to not do in, Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, but my dad is also his private pilot license, and I was able to pilot sometimes on the little Cessna with him, right? And I was always fascinated by the fact that my dad had all the answers and knew everything. But at some point, he always took out the checklist and went, "Oh, checklist, you know, the ignition, blah, 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 whatever, you know, flaps." It's got all the different checklists, because the one thing you don't want in the cockpit is for people to start prototyping creative ways of coming up with a solution, because there are tested processes. Because when you're in a moment of distress, your brain works differently, right? Then the brain needs to operate in closed mode, follow a procedure, deliver according to a certain structure and standard, which is actually the orchestration you were talking about for the meeting planning teams that need to deliver events, right? If you start changing everything on the last minute, you're testing the bandwidth of the safety of the cockpit of that event. That's what you're doing. Right? And unless you're in a simulator, I would recommend not to do that. Right? So maybe back to the collective thinking power. You think before you come up with the options and the prototypes, you create processes and things and Gantt charts and all the stuff that needs to happen to create the event. But once you agree on that and validate which options are the best, then you're in closed mode and you're in delivery mode. You don't design as you walk into the room and say, you know what, I think we should, you know, or the leader comes in and says, the piano's got to move to the right of the stage. And oh, but we have to get it tuned and this and that and the other. And maybe the pianist is right-handed. And if you do that, whatever, there's 20 million reasons why it's on that part of the stage. It's probably been thought about. Or somebody says, let's change the room setup, right? Because I'm creative and, you know, I'm the facilitator. So, you know, I never use tables, right? Or whatever. We all know this, right? And the question is, how much effort do we put in the 1% of event design time ahead of the event to make sure the 100% of total event time is well spent? And claiming that 1% time is the minimum, the least we should do. Because if we don't do that ahead of time, we're not actually valuing the time of people that are coming to the event properly. If you waste 1 minute of their time times 155 people, that's 155 minutes you've just wasted, right? This is the guilty conscience that a poor design or no design, you know, there's no such thing as no design. Something is always designed, but it can be designed at various levels of, you know, quality.
There's an interesting,
because you hit my sweet spot, Martin.
Yeah, well, let me keep hitting your sweet spot then, because there's an interesting extension of that idea actually, that's conjuring in my mind. So if we invest a lot of time in the thinking process, the planning process, working it out, but then at the event, if things don't play out or don't pan out, actually, by investing time in the preparation, we've prepared ourselves to be able to think more constructively and more positively on the fly. So let's go back to the Hudson. Let's go back to Sully. They followed their checklists, but a key part of his personal contribution was he turned on a particular power source that wasn't in the checklist and that wasn't in the sequence of events that would normally happen. And he was working off his intuition. But the point is that by having done a lot of preparatory work and invested time in the preparatory work, we are now actually, as a collective, at meetings or at events, we can be prepared for the unexpected. And when that unexpected happens, the lights go out, the power fails, we need to revert from technology to chalk and talk to the piece of paper. We can do it without losing our way. Is that a fair point to take out of it? I know you didn't say that, but that's what I'm inferring out of it.
I'm totally with you on that, and I think back to the music analogy, right? Where good improvisation or interpersonal cadence, right? When does magic happen in music? It's when the mastery of the instrument, the agreement on the form and the structure and the harmonics and the cadence in which things happen, like in jazz music, for instance, only then, when you master those three, can you improvise on top, right? So it takes a very strong foundation of knowledge and of skill to be able to then superimpose the magic, so to say, to deliver things that are beyond what's expected, right? And I think this is what we've come to expect of good events, is that things happen, you know, the magic happens that cannot be designed for, but you can design the ideal context or construct for that to potentially happen if the stars align, right? And I think this is why meetings and events are so magical in some cases, and in some cases they're not, right? And a good example there, I think, is, you know, true artists who rehearse a lot, right? Who plan out very carefully, who design their shows. You know, look at the success of the Eras tour of Taylor Swift, or I was recently visiting Jacob Collier in Copenhagen for my daughter's birthday, and he got 7,000 of us to sing together, and there was a cadence in the room, you know, in 5 different voices of people that may never have taken a singing lesson in their life, but it was a, you know, goosebump moment.
Absolutely.
That, you know, went up the back of my neck, that even if I think about it now, I get goosebumps. Right?
Yeah.
So I think the artistry in that, what makes that so unique, is the ability to facilitate. What did he do? Did he sing louder? Did he use more amplifiers? No. He orchestrated the power of the audience without even saying a word, right?
Yeah.
And you would say, you know, he would do like, he would go like, you know, 1 note higher, 1 note lower. His gestures weren't explained, but you might have seen this on Instagram somewhere. If you haven't, look at it. Jacob Collier, fascinating. The guy's like 30 years old. And at one point, instead of going 1 note up and 1 note down, all he did with his hand was like this. You know, he just made the gesture. Instead of doing this, he did this. And guess what? That audience part went down a half a tone instead of a full tone. Like, right? So are we pre-programmed in our behaviors to get instruction somehow to, you know, to be part of this collective, even without speaking? This was just like humming or singing, right? I think we are. Yeah.
And maybe I know, Paul, I'm conscious of time. We've, Ruud, as before, time just seems to fly when we're having this conversation with you.
Absolutely.
But there's maybe there's a fundamental takeaway from both of our episodes with you for chief executives, for chief financial officers, for the A-suite leadership team members, because that's really our target audience with this series of our conversations.
Yeah.
And that is, if they focus more on being facilitators of the collective power of their teams rather than being the explicit overt leaders of their teams in the meeting contexts. So I'm not trying to usurp or take away their overall authority. That's not the aim of the exercise. But in the context of meetings and events, giving up to the power of the collective is really maximizing the benefit of having had the event in the first place. Would that be a fair overall summary of where we might have come from?
Yeah, and I think there's intent of what you're expecting that's important to put into play, right? And there's a responsibility of the outcome. I think those are 2 things that the leader owns, but how they portray that ownership and how that comes to fruition best is really where, you know, going back to where you say meetings are the windows to the soul of an organization. Martin, I think that's what the leaders ultimately are responsible for, right? So that they create the petri dish that could be the meeting, or, you know, the thing where these group of people get together. And I think of the petri dishes of past companies I've worked for, and the types of leaders that I've had, and the meetings that were most effective, and the ones that were most maybe enjoyable, not always in the moment, but in hindsight, right? But most, you know, that gave the best possible outcomes for the team that was involved in it. And really there, it's about being a culture builder, culture bearer, by setting the context and figuring out the harmonics in a team, right? Which is hard. You need to find how people tick together best, because once the harmonics go against each other, it becomes painful to the ear and to many other parts of the body, right? So, yeah. Finding the harmonics and the overtones, that's the hardest part, but that's what sets good leaders apart from mediocre ones, is being able to distinguish that in your team and getting that creating that ideal petri dish for your situation.
Absolutely. And dear viewers, you have to also think about releasing the power. You are not going to do that for nothing. You are going to do that whenever you have a process that you can trust. And that's what I think Ruud is offering, is a reliable process you can trust in order for you to release the power and get the collective brain to operate for you. That's the real secret on events. And I'm telling this because, my friends, and maybe this is something new for some of you, but I am a user of the event canvas. Whenever I have a critical event, I take these resources. It's online. You can get it on the event design website. But if you put event canvas, it's so available right now that you can extract this canvas, very useful canvas for you to follow before you're planning your event. Ruud, is anything else you would like to say to our viewers in case they want to know more about this and your training offers, whatever? And Martin, I think you in the end will have to summarize this one as well, right?
So Martin, sorry for making that task maybe harder. Let me try to summarize why we do what we do, or why we use the event canvas, right? So and let me put that in my screen. Maybe Paul, if you could maximize my screen, and I can explain kind of the reason why people would apply or use this event canvas that Paul was just talking about is because if you consciously design with a team of people, then you get a committed team that stands behind it, who are able to articulate an event story on a single piece of paper, right? So those are really the three things that come out of the ability to go through the process of event design systematically, which, like you said, Martin, it might look complex if you look at it at the screen now, but it's actually quite simple. Within 2.5 hours to, in a complex event, maybe 4 hours, you can go through this because it gives you those 3 steps from change, frame, and multiple prototypes that you need to step away from this situation where people are blaming each other for all the stuff that goes wrong and put duct tape on all the things that kind of didn't work. What you want to do is say, okay, guys, let's claim the time to go and design together, right? To frame, to define what we're changing, to create the design frame of restrictions, and then come up with ways in which we're going to spend each other's time. Because whether the problem is small or big, right? Small or big being, do you want to throw a little pebble into a little bucket, or do you want to throw a boulder into the ocean, right? It depends on the challenge you have. At the end of the day, it's all about getting the right team to think about these things, and then being able to let that sink in a way that the team supports the decision that's taken, and the leader has choices, right? People don't want to be confronted with a yes/no binary choice, right? Here's what we should do. I will find 12 reasons why I think we should do it differently. What if you come up with 3 options, say, for that event that you were thinking about, you could do this, this, or this. And better yet, the last thing that we always recommend is to say, you know what? If we don't do the event, we can always choose to do that, save the budget and spend the meeting time, whatever it might be. But here's the behavior that will not get changed. And then you articulate the behaviors that will not get changed as a result of not doing the event. And then you present 3 alternatives. Well, we could do it like this, or like that. And one of those 3 could always be the way you did it before and expect a different outcome, which is the definition of insanity. We know that, right? But the alternatives and the choices I give to the leader with the argumentation back and forth, that leads to a proper ownership, right? An outcome where the story sticks and people stand behind the story that they need to go deliver. And events take obscene amounts of time to go plan and do and make work. So it's a big responsibility for event owners, and our job is to make that ownership as pleasant and as wonderful as it possibly can be. That's our role. Right?
It's amazing. And Martin, it's incredible, because what I sense here is that Ruud is actually converting the concept of an event in a tool, in
Absolutely.
a purposeful tool, right? So
Absolutely.
that's really a surprise for me, that how whenever someone asks me, how can an event do something, be purposeful, then of course, you need to have a model in order to operate that.
Yeah.
Maybe Paul, if I can just because you asked how can people get familiar with this or learn about this stuff, right? Well, one thing is download the canvas and then you get the first 100 pages of the Event Design Handbook for free, right? Because we're pretty convinced that after that, you probably want to buy the rest of the book with the case studies. There's multiple books. There's a book about design to change, which is how to apply the conversation. We have even little coloring and animation books with coloring pens where you can look at the process in 2D or 3D from the instructional design or from the experience design version, right? And these pages are mirrored
those
in a way
booklets
so
those are new. I didn't notice.
Yeah,
that.
these are new. Like we haven't been sitting on our hands even during COVID. And then we have what we call the facilitation kit, which is really kind of the way to go through the process, which includes roll cards and kind of the guidebook of all the different stuff you need to go through the process systematically, right? With the railroad tracks of how to do that effectively, and ultimately people can take training in the Event Design Certificate program. We were talking about the students. We just yesterday, the day before, I was talking to students in Ottawa and in Atlantic City. Students are learning about the event canvas and how to use it, and people can become certified event designers, which is in the Event Design Certificate program. And within 3 days, they learn how to apply this methodology, become proficient facilitators, have 6 months to go back to their team and apply it to a real event, submit it for peer review. And after that, they can obtain the designation of a CED, right, which is recognized by the Events Industry Council, MPI, and other organizations who celebrate good event design. Anyway, there's a lot of resources.
That's so amazing, Ruud. And Martin, what comes up to my mind is perhaps having an episode where perhaps Joe Allen and Ruud and maybe someone else, because this is transformative to the world, right? Because
Absolutely.
as we have better events and better meetings, the world will be a better place for all of us. Dear viewers, and this is so important that get training on your facilitation skills. That's so important. And Joe was complaining that there's no university programs to teach us to have better meetings. Of course, there's still lots of things we can discuss. Yeah, because in my mind, I still have no clear answer on how to apply these to everyday meetings, right? Because obviously, if you're hosting a critical meeting, like when I'm hosting think tank event, I obviously cannot work without the event canvas. But for daily meetings in my organization, should I use event canvas also? Is there another canvas I could use, simpler one? So that's the questions maybe we can have for another episode, and having Joe Allen on board. If you accept the challenge, Ruud and Martin,
I think
January maybe. Yeah,
I think that's an excellent idea. Let me say one more thing, Paul, because I think what you're saying is right. A meeting that occurs often is worth designing once and blueprinting into the future. I think that's an important concept, right? Yeah. The other one is events, or the types of events we don't like. Wars start with a bullet, but they end in a meeting, right? Now, think about that for a second, right? Yeah. How to replace the bullets with proper meetings that prevent the bullets in the first place.
Absolutely. That's also a great topic of discussion. Martin, over to you to finalize this for today.
Actually, for me, Paul, there's a very short, potentially very short summary of our conversation. I'll just say event canvas. It's a philosophy and it's a blueprint. It's a blueprint for bringing about behavior change at a broad level. The before, during, and after concept in event canvas requires us to think about expectations before events and compare those with outcomes after the events. Events, meetings are more or less the same thing. Within the events, we're trying to harness the collective brain. We're trying to have many people thinking and one person orchestrating. In that context, if we build strong foundations, we absolutely enable strong improvisation for when things don't work out quite the way that we had hoped or expected. I'll go back to two last points. expectations versus outcomes. If we constantly compare those, we constantly make optimum use of our time before, during, and after. My final observation is events are petri dishes of culture and culture change. Ruud, you gave us that in our first episode. You've mentioned it a couple of times in our second episode. And for me, that's the overall takeaway from our two fascinating and wonderful discussions. Thank you very, very much for an inspiring series of engagements.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm really glad we didn't leave this conversation to chance. So thank you, Paul and Martin, for planning this one and having this good conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruud. Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much, dear viewers, for staying with us so long. This has been a longer episode than usual, but I'm sure we provided valuable thoughts, reflections, inspirations, and as Ruud said, forcing you to think, right? I think it's a gift that is absolutely right. So thank you so much, dear viewers. We are airing this on December. So season's greetings for the ones who are following the tradition in the Western world. I'm sure that from people all over the world, this is also resonates good vibrations in this time of the year for everybody. So enjoy the season. Ruud, Martin, good to be with you today here.
Thanks again, Ruud.
For you too. And we'll be back in January with this expanding conversation on training, meeting designers and meeting facilitators.
Fantastic.
That's a challenge. Goodbye for now.